You've asked yourself this question 100 times. If he craves me, if he desires me, if he feels me the way I feel him, then why is he silent? And the silence can feel like rejection. It can feel like abandonment. It can even feel like proof that you're not enough. But the truth is, silence has layers. Silence doesn't always mean absence of feeling. In fact, many times, silence means the feelings are so strong, so overwhelming, that the only thing he knows how to do is withdraw. Think about it when a man desires deeply but hasn't mastered his fears. His instinct isn't to run toward you. It's to retreat into himself. Not because you don't matter, but because you matter too much. You've stirred something in him that shakes his foundations, something that collides with his old patterns, his wounds, his armor. And when craving collides with fear, silence becomes the refuge. Desire and fear are twins. Where there is great craving, there is great risk. What if he opens up and loses you? What if he surrenders and gets hurt? These are questions his silence is screaming, even when his mouth stays closed. And if you can hear the truth behind the silence, you'll realize it's not that he doesn't feel, it's that he feels so much he doesn't know how to handle it. You see, many men were not taught how to sit with vulnerability. They were taught to fight, to conquer, to win. Vulnerability feels like defeat, and silence feels safer than surrender. But behind that silence is a man wrestling with the deepest paradox of love, the craving to be close and the terror of being known. So when you're faced with silence, don't rush to fill it with fear. Don't immediately assume it means rejection. Instead, let it reveal the truth. This man is standing at the edge of transformation. His silence is the battleground between his old story and his desire for you. It's the pause before the leap. And while you cannot control his leap, you can control your own energy, your own response. When you choose compassion instead of insecurity, strength instead of panic, patience instead of pressure, you create space for him to step out of the prison of his silence. And sometimes that space is the very thing that calls him forward. His silence is not your enemy. It's the echo of his unspoken craving and the proof that he's confronting something bigger than he's ever faced before. The truth that will shock you is this: if he craves you and stays silent, it's not about you being unworthy. It's about you being powerful enough to awaken a part of him that even he doesn't fully understand. That silence is not emptiness. It's the roar of transformation waiting to happen. Silence is one of the most misunderstood forms of communication, especially in relationships. When you care for someone, when you feel their energy and presence and they suddenly go silent, it's easy to interpret it as rejection. You might begin to think, he really wanted me, he would say something, he would show me, he would pursue me. But the truth is, silence does not always equal rejection. Silence is layered. It carries stories, fears, and unspoken emotions that words can't always capture. And when a man craves you but chooses silence, it doesn't mean he doesn't feel. It means there's an internal battle happening beneath the surface that most people will never take the time to understand. Think about this: communication is not just what is said, but what is withheld. Sometimes silence is not absence. Sometimes silence is the loudest signal a person can give. For many men, especially those who crave love but are unfamiliar with vulnerability, silence becomes a shield. It's a way of protecting themselves from the overwhelming nature of their own desire. When someone feels strongly but doesn't know how to navigate those feelings, the easiest response is to retreat into quiet. It's not that they don't feel. It's that they feel too much. We've been conditioned to see love as something that should always be expressed openly and passionately. But not everyone was raised in an environment where vulnerability was safe. For some, silence is survival. Silence is learned behavior. And so when a man is silent, it's rarely a reflection of your worth or the depth of his craving. It's a reflection of his conditioning, his fear of being exposed, or his uncertainty about how to handle what he feels. To assume silence means rejection is to misunderstand the complexity of human emotions. Imagine a man standing in front of a door that leads to his greatest desire. He wants to open it, but he also knows that once he does, he's stepping into a territory where he can be seen, judged, even hurt. His craving tells him to walk through. His fear tells him to stand still. That paralysis often shows up as silence. It's not a no. It's a not yet. It's a moment of hesitation that reveals the depth of the stakes involved. When the heart is on the line, silence often replaces speech because the risk of saying the wrong thing feels unbearable. Another reason silence is misread as rejection is because we live in a culture that equates action with validation. We think if someone isn't showing us attention, if they're not constantly proving their affection through words or behaviors, then they must not care. But love is not always loud. Desire is not always noisy. Sometimes the greatest craving hides in the quiet spaces, in the pauses, in the moments when words fail. To dismiss silence as indifference is to overlook the possibility that the silence itself is sacred, that it's holding the weight of emotions too powerful to be put into sentences. So, when you encounter silence from someone who craves you, the first shift you must make is within yourself. Rather than asking, what am I doing wrong? Ask, what is this silence protecting? Because silence is rarely about you. It's about the other person's relationship with themselves. It's about the fear of being seen, the terror of vulnerability, and the struggle of balancing desire with self-preservation. And once you realize that, you stop personalizing the silence and start seeing it as part of a much deeper story. The truth is, silence is not rejection. It is communication. It is the language of someone whose emotions run deeper than their words can handle. And if you can understand that, you can begin to hold space for the silence without letting it define your worth. Because silence, in the end, is often the shadow side of craving. It is not proof of a lack of feeling, but proof that the feeling is too powerful to be easily expressed. Desire and fear are two forces that often lie side by side in the human heart, and nowhere is this more evident than in relationships. When a man craves you deeply, that craving awakens something primal in him, the urge to connect, to merge, to let down his walls. But along with that desire comes an equal and opposite force, fear. Fear of being rejected, fear of being vulnerable, fear of being hurt in ways that echo old wounds. These two energies dance together, pulling him in opposite directions, and the result is often confusion, withdrawal, or silence. It's important to understand that desire is not a simple emotion. Desire is layered with longing, anticipation, and the possibility of fulfillment. It is powerful, magnetic, and it drives people to act in ways they normally wouldn't. But the stronger the desire, the more terrifying the potential loss. That's why fear appears almost immediately in its shadow. Fear whispers, what if I give myself fully and she doesn't stay? What if I open up and I'm not enough? What if the very thing I want most ends up breaking me? These fears can be louder than the craving itself, and they can paralyze someone from expressing what they feel. This is why so many people behave in contradictory ways when they want someone. They lean in, then pull back. They show a glimpse of their craving, and then suddenly go cold. It's not that the desire vanished, it's that the fear surged. The fear becomes a counterweight to the craving, creating a push-pull dynamic that can be confusing to anyone on the receiving end. But when you can see this clearly, you begin to realize that what looks like rejection is often just fear standing guard over the heart. Imagine a man standing at the edge of a cliff. On the other side is the life he craves, love, intimacy, connection, the freedom of being fully seen and accepted. But in between where he stands and where he longs to be is a gap he must leap across. Desire urges him forward, but fear warns him of the fall. This is the reality of craving. It pushes him toward you, but fear holds him back in silence, hesitation, or withdrawal. To an outside observer, it might look like disinterest, but inside, the battle between desire and fear is raging. This paradox is part of the human condition. The same intensity of emotion that draws us to another person can also awaken our deepest insecurities. The more we want, the more we fear losing. The more powerful the craving, the more terrifying the vulnerability required to meet it. And so many men hide behind silence, not because the craving isn't real, but because it's too real. It threatens to dismantle the defenses they've built, and those defenses feel safer than the risk of rejection. The key is to recognize that desire and fear are not enemies. They are partners. Fear is the shadow of desire. It exists because something valuable is at stake. If there were no craving, there would be no fear. If he didn't care about losing you, he wouldn't be afraid. So when you see his silence or his hesitation, understand that it's not a lack of desire, but evidence of its depth. The fear reveals how much you matter, even if his words cannot. When you shift your perspective to see fear as a companion to craving, you stop misinterpreting it as rejection. You begin to see the humanity in it, the fragile, tender side of someone grappling with emotions that are bigger than their capacity to express. And instead of responding with insecurity, you can respond with compassion, patience, and strength. Because when desire and fear collide, what he needs most is the safety to choose desire without being crushed by fear. Many men crave connection on the deepest level, yet struggle with the vulnerability that connection demands. It's not that they don't want closeness, intimacy, or love. They do. In fact, they crave it so powerfully that it shakes their inner world. But craving and accessing are not the same thing. A man can long for closeness and at the same time lack the tools, the safety, or the courage to allow himself to step fully into it. And when that happens, silence becomes his shield. It becomes the wall he hides behind, the armor he wears to keep himself from feeling overwhelmed by the very thing he desires most. For many men, vulnerability feels like danger. From a young age, they may have been conditioned to equate vulnerability with weakness. They were taught to be strong, to push down their emotions, to never let others see their fears. So when love arrives, when craving surges through their system, it doesn't feel like joy at first, it feels like exposure. It feels like their carefully crafted armor is cracking, and that is terrifying. Silence then becomes a way to maintain control. Instead of revealing the depth of their craving, they choose stillness, withdrawal, and quiet as a form of protection. This doesn't mean they don't care. In fact, the very intensity of their craving often heightens their need for silence. Think of it like this: when someone is flooded with emotions they cannot manage, their instinct is to retreat. They don't retreat because they don't feel. They retreat because they feel too much. And silence is often the only way they know to regulate themselves. It becomes a tool even if it is misunderstood by the person on the receiving end. This dynamic can create confusion. To the woman experiencing it, silence feels like rejection. She sees his craving when he's close. She feels the energy of his desire, but then suddenly it vanishes into quiet distance. She wonders, how can someone who wants me so much disappear like this? The truth is that the disappearance is not about her worth. It's about his capacity. Craving has exposed him to feelings he doesn't fully know how to handle, and silence is his attempt to regain balance. At its core, silence is a form of self-protection. Vulnerability requires trust, safety, and surrender, things that don't come easily to someone who has spent years guarding themselves. To him, revealing his emotions feels like handing over the keys to his soul, and that's a risk he may not be ready for. The craving is real, but the silence is the wall he hides behind until he can find the courage to let that craving become action. It's also important to see silence as a survival pattern. For men who have been hurt, abandoned, or shamed in the past, silence is the way they avoid repeating that pain. When they feel themselves slipping into desire, the alarm bells go off. Be careful. Don't get too close. Don't reveal too much. And so they retreat into quiet. It's not a rejection of the person they crave, but a rejection of the risk that craving brings. When you understand this, you stop interpreting silence as indifference. You begin to see that silence is actually proof of the depth of the feeling. He wouldn't need silence if he didn't care. He wouldn't need armor if you didn't matter. Silence is not emptiness. It is evidence of a battle within. And when you realize this, you gain the ability to respond with compassion instead of panic. You no longer take it personally. You understand that his craving is there, alive and undeniable, but that his silence is the only way he knows how to survive the vulnerability it awakens. Silence can feel like abandonment, but often it is nothing more than a reflection of unhealed wounds. Every person carries emotional history, and for many men, that history is riddled with moments where vulnerability led to pain. A boy who grew up in an environment where showing feelings was punished, mocked, or ignored learns to silence himself as a defense. A man who once opened his heart only to have it shattered remembers that sting, and without even realizing it, builds walls around his emotions. So when he craves connection today, that craving awakens not just desire, but also the memory of pain. His silence isn't about indifference. It is the echo of unhealed wounds whispering, be careful. Don't let this happen again. These wounds operate beneath the surface. On the outside, it may look like he's simply choosing not to speak, not to show up, not to step forward. But internally, he is wrestling with the ghosts of his past. The craving for closeness collides with the fear of reopening old scars. Silence becomes the middle ground, a way to feel the desire without taking the risk. It is a coping mechanism, a way to hold on to control when his heart is telling him to surrender. The mistake so many people make is assuming silence is a lack of love. They think if he really wanted me, he would fight for me, he would speak up, he would make sure I knew. But love doesn't always appear in grand gestures or eloquent words. For someone with unhealed wounds, silence is not proof of absence. It is proof of the presence of deep, unresolved pain. It is evidence that the craving is powerful enough to awaken his defenses. If you meant nothing, he would not need silence at all. This is why relationships often stir emotions that are disproportionate to the moment. It's not just about you and him now. It's about everything he's lived before you. The unhealed wound from childhood, the betrayal from a past relationship, the shame of once being vulnerable and rejected, all of it gets triggered when his craving for you arises. That craving is a reminder of everything he's longed for and everything he's been afraid of. And silence becomes the safest option because silence cannot wound him further. But here's the paradox. The very silence that protects him also keeps him from the love he desires most. His unhealed wounds convince him that staying quiet will keep him safe, yet that safety comes at the cost of connection. It's a prison disguised as protection, and until those wounds are faced, he will continue to oscillate between craving and retreat, between longing and silence. For the person on the receiving end, this can feel exhausting, even heartbreaking. You may find yourself questioning your worth, wondering why his craving doesn't translate into action. But when you see his silence through the lens of unhealed wounds, you realize it's not about you failing to inspire him. It's about him struggling with the ghosts of his past. The silence is his scar tissue, his armor, his shield against pain that predates you. This understanding shifts everything. Instead of taking his silence as a personal rejection, you begin to see it as an opportunity for compassion. You realize that his craving is real, but so is his fear. You recognize that his silence is not a measure of your value, but a reflection of his journey. And while you cannot heal his wounds for him, you can choose how you interpret his behavior. You can choose to respond with strength instead of insecurity, patience instead of panic. Because the truth is, silence is often the language of the wounded. It doesn't mean he doesn't care. It means he cares so much that it terrifies him. And until those wounds are acknowledged, silence will continue to be his refuge. But understanding this allows you to stop taking that silence as rejection and start seeing it for what it truly is, a mirror of the past that still lives within him. What looks like distance can actually be the testing ground for deeper commitment. When someone craves you yet seems to step back, their silence and withdrawal may appear to be a sign of detachment. But in reality, it is often a process of inner evaluation. He is asking himself questions he may not even know how to articulate. Can I handle this level of connection? Can I trust myself to show up fully? Can I trust her to stay if I reveal everything? That distance, though painful to witness, is not always rejection. It is a sacred pause, a moment where he measures the weight of his emotions against the fears that come with them. Think of it like a blacksmith forging steel. Before the weapon is strong enough to endure, it must pass through fire and pressure. In the same way, his craving for you passes through the heat of his doubts and the pressure of his insecurities. Distance becomes the fire, silence the pressure. It is in this space that he begins to determine if his craving is merely an impulse or if it is something he is willing to build into commitment. This testing ground is rarely comfortable for either him or you. To you, it feels like mixed signals, moments of intense closeness followed by retreat. You wonder, if he feels so much, why doesn't he move forward? But that retreat is not always a sign of wavering affection. It is often the very process that deepens it. Just as muscles grow stronger by tearing and repairing, love grows more real when it survives the tension between desire and fear. His distance is not necessarily a departure. It may be the cocoon stage of transformation where craving must be tested before it can become love. The paradox is that many people misinterpret this testing ground as indifference. They take his silence personally, assuming it means he doesn't care enough. But in reality, it is precisely because he cares so deeply that he withdraws. If the feelings were shallow, he could speak without hesitation. If you didn't matter, he wouldn't need silence to think. The very act of retreat reveals the weight of what he feels. Sometimes this space is necessary for him to face himself. Craving another person is not just about longing for them. It's about confronting who you must become in order to love them fully. His distance may be the arena where he is wrestling with his old patterns, questioning his capacity, or deciding whether he is willing to step into vulnerability. That process, though invisible, is essential for true commitment. Without it, desire might remain surface level, driven by impulse instead of rooted in choice. And this is why patience is so powerful in these moments. When you can see his silence not as abandonment, but as a refining process, you free yourself from spiraling into insecurity. You stop making his withdrawal about your worth and start understanding it as his journey. You realize that his distance may actually be creating the foundation for something stronger, a commitment not born of impulse but of conviction. What looks like distance, then, is often a pause before devotion. It is the testing ground where craving is examined, where fear is confronted, and where choices are clarified. The silence that feels unbearable to you may be the very silence that allows him to gather the courage to love you more fully. And when he emerges from that space, his decision to step forward carries more power because it has been tested in the fire of his doubts. So the next time you feel the sting of his distance, remember this truth: distance is not always the end. Sometimes it is the preparation for a new beginning. His silence is not a void but a crucible, shaping his craving into commitment, transforming desire into something that can endure. Understanding his silence requires you to step into compassion and strength, not insecurity. When someone you care about goes quiet, the natural instinct is to assume it's about you. Your mind races, spinning stories. Did I do something wrong? Am I not enough? Has he lost interest? These thoughts fuel insecurity, and insecurity makes silence feel louder than it really is. But the truth is, silence is rarely about you. More often, it is about his inner battle, his fears, his unhealed wounds, his doubts, his struggle with vulnerability. And if you want to navigate that silence in a way that brings connection rather than division, you must rise above insecurity and meet it with compassion and strength. Compassion is the ability to see beyond the surface. Instead of taking his silence at face value, compassion invites you to look deeper. It asks you to say, this isn't rejection, this is protection. This is someone grappling with emotions bigger than they know how to express. When you shift into compassion, you stop reacting from your own fear. You stop making his silence about your worth, and you begin to see it as a reflection of his inner journey. Compassion softens the sting of silence because it allows you to understand that it's not meant to hurt you, it's meant to protect him. But compassion alone is not enough. Strength is also required. Strength is what keeps you grounded when his silence triggers your insecurities. It's the reminder that your value does not diminish just because someone else struggles to express their desire. Strength allows you to stand firm in your self-worth, even in the face of uncertainty. It's the voice inside that says, I am whole, I am worthy, and I do not need external validation to prove it. When you step into strength, you stop chasing after explanations. You stop begging for clarity. You learn to hold space without losing yourself in the process. This balance between compassion and strength is transformative. Compassion allows you to empathize with his struggle. Strength ensures you don't get lost in it. Together, they create a presence that is powerful and magnetic. When you embody compassion and strength, you become a safe space for him to emerge from his silence while also protecting your own energy. You show him that his silence does not control you, that you are not shaken by his withdrawal, and that you are capable of holding steady even when he cannot. Responding with insecurity, on the other hand, often drives him further into silence. When you panic, push, or demand answers, it reinforces his fear of vulnerability. It tells him that his silence is dangerous, that it has too much power, and that intimacy will only lead to conflict. But when you respond with compassion and strength, you do the opposite. You disarm his defenses. You show him that you see the man behind the silence, not just the silence itself. That level of presence creates safety. And safety is what allows vulnerability to emerge. It is also important to remember that your response to silence is a reflection of your own growth. If his quiet shakes you to your core, it may be an invitation to examine your own wounds, your own fears of abandonment, your own need for constant reassurance. His silence can become a mirror, showing you where you are still learning to trust yourself, to anchor yourself, to know your worth independent of his actions. And in that sense, his silence becomes a teacher, not of your inadequacy, but of your capacity to rise higher. When you understand the silence no longer feels like a threat, it becomes an opportunity to deepen both your empathy and your resilience. You stop trying to fix him or force him to speak, and instead you embody the energy that gives him permission to find his own courage. Compassion says, I see your struggle. Strength says, but I will not abandon myself in the process. Together they create a response that transforms silence into a space where connection can grow. In the end, silence is not rejection. It is a mirror reflecting desire, fear, wounds, and the hidden testing ground of love. And the way you choose to respond to it will define whether it becomes a wall or a bridge. When you step out of insecurity and into compassion and strength, you not only honor his journey, but you elevate your own, proving that true connection is not about forcing words, but about holding space for transformation. Remember, if he craves you and yet remains silent, it is not because you are not enough. It is because you have awakened something in him that is larger than his current capacity to express. Trust that, honor that, and keep your heart anchored in your worth. Thank you for giving me the privilege of speaking into your life today, for opening your heart to these truths, and for choosing to rise into the version of yourself that love, life, and destiny have been calling you to become.